now you know a little bit about the first business games ever used in corporations, let's talk about the concept of wargaming, which is the foundation upon which Mary built her business games. What is a war game? When and where were they invented? And why does it matter from a learning and development perspective? Previously, we talked about how a Russian woman named Mary Burstein used the concept of a war game to inform her business simulation development way back in the 1930s. So now let's look at this thing that she used as inspiration called a war game. So while you might think any game that involves armies is called a war game, yeah, duh, please. But that's not actually the case. In fact, the term war game in some circles is a very specific genre of simulation games. Sure, Call of Duty is definitely a war game, but that's not the kind of war game we're going to be talking about here. Instead, let's define the term war game based on the definition of Peter Perella in his book, The Art of Wargaming, published by the Naval Institute Press. In that book, he defines wargaming as a warfare model or simulation using rules, data, and procedure not involving actual military forces, and in which the flow of events is affected by and in turn affects decisions made during the course of those events by the players representing opposite sides. So thank you, Peter Perella, and check out the book, The Art of Wargaming, published by the Naval Institute in 1990. If you're interested, that quote happens to be on page 274. Now, looking to another source, Wikipedia defines the term wargame as a type of strategy game that simulates warfare realistically, typically using a map that depicts various battlefield terrains, features such as woods, hills, etc., and typically has a grid or location system superimposed on top of the terrain to regulate the movement and positions of the game pieces and actions, so you know how far a cannon or a tank can shoot or how fast troops move over the surface. But to fully understand wargaming and what it has to do with creating a learning game, we need to go back in time. Let's travel back to 1770. Now, before this time period, games were fairly abstract and were symmetrical because most were modeled on a form of chess, where each side gets an equal number of pieces, the board shaped like a square, and the movements are restricted by both the pieces and the grid on the board. In the academic journal called The History of European Ideas, an author named Paul Sherman wrote an article called Models of War, 1770 to 1830, the birth of war games and the trade-off between realism and simplicity. In that article, he discusses 12 war games or military board games that were published during that time period. That was a big time period for war games. We won't go into all 12, but it's interesting to note right off the bat the tension between realism and simplicity in terms of game design. And that's been with us for quite some time. If we truly want to develop games for learning, we need to come to grips with that tension, realism versus abstract ease of play. In the article, several methods are discussed for how game designers of the time grappled with the balancing of that realism and complexity. Elements such as rules and complex scoring processes within the game can help to reinforce realism, but often at the cost of complexity and a stoppage in the flow of game, which kind of ruins the whole fun aspect of it and engagement aspect of it. Several methods were undertaken to avoid complexity, which are still relevant today if you want to create a learning game. One is to not include unnecessary features. Some early game designers stressed minimum time, minimum space, minimum unit, and minimum difficulties. In fact, the number of minimums stated actually leads one to say, push the number of minimums to the maximum. Get it? Yeah. Anyway, the practical result of this is to use general and abstract principles to group together multiple individual actions or cases within the gameplay. So what does that mean? Well, for example, all infantry troops can move no more than 4 spaces regardless of terrain. Perhaps not true in real life, but to have a rule for swamps, a rule for fields, a rule for hills, a rule for forest, a rule for roads, well, you get the point. In a board game environment, you'd constantly be looking up troop movement rules, and that would take the fun out of the game. at least the board game aspect. Another interesting attempt to simplify the gameplay was a movement away from the strategic toward the tactical. So rather than planning military campaigns, the focus became on one single military battle. It was argued that the change in focus minimized complexity. So from a business sense, it would mean switching from playing a game where you ran a company to playing a game where you ran a department. These methods are still worth considering whenever you are confronted with the need to develop a learning game. In addition to simplifying reality and keeping the right balance, you also might think of the underlying model on which your learning game is built. This can be very important. Shorman makes an important point when he indicates that games themselves can be considered models of complex systems, in his case warfare, but that they're passive. The model of the battlefield doesn't take on any meaning until a simulation is run with the model. The model is passive, but the simulation itself is active. What the players do is active. This is an important takeaway, so keep that in mind. Here are some other important takeaways. A learning game in and of itself doesn't teach. It's the playing of the game that holds the instructional value. A learning game designer simply sets up the conditions in which learning can occur, and then the act of playing the game leads to the learning. This is important because as you begin to think about learning game design, you need to think about creating the right model and then think about the right instructions to run the game or simulation so that learning actually occurs as a result. If you want to teach leadership skills, what's the right model if you want to teach those skills? If you teach sales skills, what's the right model? Negotiation skills or empathy skills? You need to determine the right model. That's a big part of a learning game, and that goes back clear to these games to the 1700s. Answer the question, what's the right model upon which to develop my game? Part of game design is model design. Sherman also states in his examination of the 12 games, the designers of these games stress the big advantage of a war game over a textbook, or flat training in our case, was the ability of the war game to show rather than tell the young officers what they needed to know. War games demanded active participation rather than passive absorption of content. The same is true today about corporate-focused games. Sherman goes on to say that during this time period, war games started to be seen as useful for simulations of future battles and not just instructional purposes. In fact, he states that in the Napoleonic era, we see the development of war games that had the potential to become practical rather than merely instructive. War games, although none of this actually happened during that time period, had that potential, and he saw that potential. So eventually, that's exactly what war games are going to be used for. Let's summarize lessons learned from war games that we can apply to the development of our own learning games. Okay, so lesson number 1, you need to carefully balance realism and simplicity. Now, fortunately, computers have made some of the complexity of games invisible to the players. You can program algorithms and specific logic to provide more realistic actions and reactions in the games that the learners never really need to understand. They can just see the final result. So it might be highly complex, your game, in terms of what's happening in the game engine behind the scenes, but will look pretty simple to the player. But still, if you don't have a team of programmers, or if you decide to create an analog board or a card game, you will still be wrestling with the balance between simplicity and realism. And if you do have to err on one side or another, err on the side of simplicity. Keep the game as simple as you can without sacrificing too much realism. Lesson 2 is to use both general and abstract principles to group together multiple individual actions or cases within the gameplay, meaning give similar pieces or parts the same attributes to keep it easier for yourself. Remember, we talked about moving troops through all different types of terrain with the same amount of movement. Believe me, this concept of keeping things similar in terms of rules will definitely make your life easier as you design a learning game. Lesson 3, make sure you get the underlying model correct. Any game based on reality needs to be built around underlying models. When you create a game about decision making, you need to have a vision of how correct decisions are made. If you create a game about empathy, you need to have a model through which you can believe empathy can be fostered. Spend time on your underlying model before you spend a ton of time on game development. Lesson 4, it's not the game that teaches, it's the playing of the game. This means that you need to play test and play test again your learning game. You need to make sure the act of playing the game elicits the correct learning outcome. This can only be done by playing the game. So play test a lot. Application of these lessons will help you to create effective learning games that help the players see relationships, make proper trade-offs, and even learn to predict certain outcomes. And finally, as you develop games or any type of instruction, always remember to play, learn, and have fun.